Colum McCann was born in Ireland and is the internationally best-selling author of 7 novels, including Zoli, Let the Great World Spin, and Transatlantic, as well as 2 critically acclaimed story collections. His fiction has been published in 35 languages, and he is a contributor to The New Yorker, The New York Times Magazine, The Atlantic Monthly, and the Paris Review. In 2005, McCann's short film, Everything in This Country Must, was nominated for an Academy Award. His novel, Let the Great World Spin, called the first great novel about 9/11 by Esquire, won several awards, including the National Book Award, the International Impact Dublin Literary Award, and was named a notable book by the New York Times and the American Library Association. It has been adopted for common reading at Boston College, Duke University, and New York University. McCann's most recent novel, Transatlantic, ties together a series of narratives that spans 150 years and 2 continents, and has been hailed as a spectacular achievement. Colum McCann currently teaches in the MFA Creative Writing program at Hunter College in New York City, and he is here with us today. Please join me in welcoming Colum McCann.
Thank you so much. I have to tell you, I'm sitting there thinking, it's really an extraordinary thing to be able to shut an Irishman up for a long time. But all I really want to do is sit here and think about these 4 stories. This is the most remarkable panel that I've ever been on, and I think it's just an extraordinary thing. And I'm thinking, how do I make sense of this? That 5 of us are up there and telling our stories. And then it struck me that a lot of things can happen in our lives. We can have our houses taken away from us. We can have our dignity taken away from us. We can have all sorts of physical possessions, family taken away from us. But the one thing that can never, ever be taken away from us is our stories. And so we are sort of engaged in that essential, really pure democracy that is storytelling. And I just thought it was absolutely it was one of the greatest hours here, just sitting here listening to all of this. And I think we're going to have to destroy the notion of a common read and have at least a 4-book common read and maybe a 5-book common read at the end of it all. So, I've been thinking about this and what it was like when I was 17, 18, and how the books that I stumbled upon, Richard Brautigan, Kerouac, Ferlinghetti, how they opened up the lungs of the world for me, and how I remember them, still to this very day, I remember the experience. And in a way, I envy you the fact that you get a chance to open up the lungs of the world for all these young people across the country. And what will happen to them and what will happen to their imaginations. I don't think that there's any one book that can be chosen. I think all of these things build upon one another. And there's no bad book ever to choose. But I do think that we have to think about our youngsters. I have a 17-year-old, and she's about to be applying to college next year. And I wonder what it is that we can give her that will shape the world for her. And I know that all of these stories that we hear today will shape the world for her. And one of the other common denominators that is moving through this is the incredible empathy, the sort of the empathy that is available in each one of these authors. And so I'm floored and almost silent, and humbled to be here to chat with you about this mighty weapon of language and storytelling that we have. I will tell you that when I write books, I feel like I'm an adventurer, and I'm heading off, and most of the time I don't know where it is that I'm going to go. I head out in a little boat, and the vast majority of the time when I head out in that little boat, I end up capsizing after a little while. Sometimes I get taken off by drift away on a current, and it turns out to be the wrong current, and it brings me back to the shore that I left. Other times I just drown, literally. But every now and then, what happens to me as a writer is that I find a little island. And that island I sort of land upon as an adventurer, wondering what it is that I'm going to find. One hopes that it is going to be a sort of a Galapagos of the human imagination, that you will find things, people, creatures, ideas there, where you can develop a sort of theory of human nature and being. And this is what happened to me, I suppose, in a certain way, on the day of September the 11th, 2001, when my father-in-law, Roger Hawke, was in the first building to be hit, the second building to come down in New York. And he came up he got out of the building, thankfully, and he came up to our apartment where I was living on the east side of New York. I make a bad joke that I happen to be the least cool writer in the whole of New York, because I don't live in Brooklyn. I live on the Upper East Side. But anyway, he came up, and my daughter ran into his arms, and then she shied away, and she said, "Oh, Poppy's burning," because she smelled the smoke off his clothes. And I said, "No, love, Poppy's not burning. There was a fire downtown." She was 3, almost 4 years old. And then she said, no, Poppy is burning from the inside out. And I thought, out of the mouth of babes. Not consciously was she saying this, but that's what she felt was happening. And I knew at that moment that I would eventually have to write about what was happening around me and where I was in relation to this great tragedy that was unfolding in my adopted city. Well, I will tell you that almost immediately I thought of Philippe Petit's tightrope walk across the World Trade Center towers. It happened on August the 7th, 1974, when he broke into the World Trade Center, and almost like a bank caper, he was able to get up to the top of the towers and string a tightrope across from one side to the other. You will see him here, and I'll talk about this photograph in just a minute. That's him, that little fly speck in the middle between the two buildings there. And he walked across 8 times, and I thought that this particular act of creation, this act of beauty, this act of daring, this act of bravado, this act of foolishness, sort of stood in perfect opposition to me, to the act of evil destruction that happened 27 years later. And so I began to write a novel called Let the Great World Spin, which takes place in New York on the particular day when all this happens. And it's a symphony of the city, if you will. There's an Irish monk who lives in the Bronx. There's an artist. There's a young programmer who's developing the DARPANET or the ARPANET, the beginnings of what we now know as the Internet. There's a mother on Park Avenue who's just lost her son in Vietnam. And together all these people are tied by the tightrope walk, but also by an act of grace, an act of decency, an act of healing in what turns out to be a very dark world. The novel posits the idea that darkness itself makes the light visible, and that from trauma, as we've seen from everybody here today, from trauma can actually come great grace and belonging. It's a novel, therefore, that can be read just about people in 1974, but it's also a novel that can be read as an allegory of 9/11. So it can choose to be interpreted on any number of levels. But this is the thing about literature. All good works of literature, it seems to me, are open. That they should be, that we should not be telling our young people what to think. We should be allowing them to feel. We should not be telling our people, our young people, this is exactly the way it was, develop your theories of life around this, but to give them the tools and the ability to learn. Nobody needs to be told anything anymore. What we need, and we must be allowed to interpret. And so I would hope that the applications of my own novel would hopefully be manifold. That, you know, it could be used by engineers to talk about the tightrope walk, the cavalettis, the pressure space that can be done. It can be used by techies to talk about the internet. It can be used by artists to talk about the development of art, say in the early 70s. It can be used to talk about liberation theology, which was extant, of course, in the early 70s, or any number of things. But ultimately, what I think is that a book should be there for the people, the readers, to come out of it at the end sort of transformed and questioning. And the best thing that we can give to all our youngsters is the ability to question. I'm going to read you just a little section of the novel that relates to this photograph. This photo was taken by Vin DeLucia from, I think, the New York Post or the New York Times. I think it says at the bottom there, on August 7, 1974. This little section is about a woman who owns this photograph. She's actually the granddaughter of one of my favorite characters in the book, a woman named Tilly, who's a prostitute in the Bronx. A thing that my wife jokes is the most semi-autobiographical part of the novel. So, how do you know all that stuff? This is just a half page about Tilly's granddaughter, and she owns this photograph. Roaring seaward, and I go. She often wonders what it is that holds that man so high in the air. What sort of ontological glue? Up there in his haunted silhouette, a dark thing against the sky, a small stick figure in the vast expanse. The plane on the horizon, the tiny thread of rope between the edges of the buildings, the bar in his hands, the great spread of space. The photo was taken on the exact same day her mother died. It was one of the reasons she was attracted to it in the first place, the sheer fact that such beauty had occurred at the same time. She had found it, yellowing and torn, in a garage sale in San Francisco 4 years ago, at the bottom of a box of photographs. The world delivers its surprises. She bought it, got it framed, kept it with her as she went from hotel to hotel. A man high in the air while a plane disappears, it seems, into the edge of the building. One small scrap of history meeting a larger one, as if the walking man were somehow anticipating what would come later. The intrusion of time and history, the collision point of stories. We wait for the explosion, but it never occurs. The plane passes. The tightrope walker gets to the end of the wire. Things don't fall apart. And it strikes her now as an enduring moment, the man alone against scale, still capable of myth in the face of all other evidence. And I suppose to me, that's what my philosophy is, that we're still capable of myth in the face of the evidence that the world presents to us. In other words, the world gets deeper and rounder, and that's what makes it spin. And so, when I've had a chance to talk to young people in the colleges, in particular, I went back to Boston College just last week, and I met some of the young people who I talked to 2 years ago. It was absolutely extraordinary that they were able to relate to the book, carry it with them, and then come up to me 2 years later and tell me, in some instances, profoundly life-changing moments that they had, not because of my book, but because of the teachers who were there, because of the ethos of the college, because the way in which they were allowed to expand themselves as young people. So that was a great moment for me, just to be involved in a read like that. The second book that I'm going to just say very quickly about is a book called TRANSATLANTIC, and that takes the stories of Frederick Douglass, when he was 27 years old, still a slave, went to Ireland in 1846 to see the famine unfolding at his feet. An extraordinary story of a man who finds himself in a moral quandary in relation to what is happening in Ireland. Also the story of Alcock and Brown, who did the first transatlantic flight across from Newfoundland to Ireland in 1919. And also the story of Senator George Mitchell, who went to Ireland to help negotiate our peace process in the 1990s. How are those stories all glued together? It's glued together with the stories of women. I weave in this fiction and non-fiction, and so I suppose that this is a novel about history, a novel about how every moment affects the next moment, a novel about our interconnectedness, how the past, as Faulkner says, is never really past, and about how we matter. And most of all, a novel about peace. I am very flattered to be here amongst all these people. As I say, I think this is possibly one of the most extraordinary collisions of stories that I have come upon in all my 25 years of talking about books. And I'm humbled by it, and I hope I get a chance to talk to you all later. Thank you so much.